begin, I'm just going to point out something that you may already know, and that is the climate crisis is a wicked problem. It has many dimensions. Of course, there's degrowth, carrying capacity, collapse, planetary boundaries, carbon credits, etc. It's disorientating, but I always believed when I started this project that we needed scalable climate finance. This is what the policy is about, and it uses a carbon currency as the instrument. In this presentation, I will also talk about the opportunities for blockchains, and I will finish off with a philosophical discussion of degrowth versus green growth. A good place to start is the problem, as it's explained with the carbon budget. So you've probably seen this before many times in reports. What's important about this graph is that it presents a very challenging carbon trajectory to stay under 1.5 degrees. 2 degrees is, yes, it's different, but more or less the challenge is similar. We know from various studies that we're missing at least $3 trillion per year over the next few decades, maybe more, depends how you want to calculate it. And we need that money for clean, renewable energy infrastructure, conventional mitigation, and important is the timing, because if we don't build the new infrastructure, if we don't avoid mining the fossil fuels, we end up with carbon lock-in, and that locks us into a dirty future. That's the problem. There are other problems here too. It's not just about carbon, it's about where the carbon goes. So we have to be aware that biodiversity and putting carbon in the right places is part of the problem, or the challenge. We now know from various studies that we have to remove carbon from the atmosphere. It's necessary. An optimistic scenario is that we would need about $1 trillion per year for carbon removal. And also carbon removal is complicated by biodiversity and carbon farming and so on. I'm sure you're all aware of those issues. Many of you probably have heard of Ministry for the Future. It's been a great advertising medium for our policy. Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote the novel, he got the idea from some papers I published with my colleagues, and these papers introduced the policy concepts. The policy is unique because it provides scalable debt-free climate finance and it's targeted finance. It's also unique because it proposes that cooperation, which is also needed, can be greatly enhanced with carrot and stick pricing. So we have a lot of sticks, but not enough carrots. We need, this policy is unique because it also offers 100% funding for carbon removal. That's important because carbon removal is not only expensive, it generally requires energy as an input, and it doesn't necessarily produce goods and services that can be sold. And what that means is that the funding probably cannot be managed with loans. So you need grant funding. And this policy provides proportional grants. It also has a focus on providing, obviously, the finance for clean energy, I mentioned that, and finance for hard-to-abate industries. So we're funding both the supply side and the demand side of the energy equation. It's also a policy that's based on new market theory. I always wanted to develop a policy that could be understood and connected with standard economic theory. So it took me actually 8 years to get to this point. That's a long time, isn't it, to develop a policy? But the reason it took so long is because I needed the justifications. So the justifications have to be understood by economists in terms of their conceptual models and their existing theories. As it turns out, the theory for this policy is framed by risk management. So it's a risk management policy. By the way, how's the sound? Okay, carbon pricing matrix. This is the theory, actually. It's presented in this relational diagram. A lot of the details are missing here because I didn't want to overwhelm you with too much technical stuff. But basically, our carbon pricing matrix, it identifies the 4 major policies for pricing carbon through governmental policy. So we know about taxes. You've all heard of cap and trade. You know carbon subsidies, like maybe Q45 or whatever. The carbon reward is new, and textbooks do not actually present policies this way. They don't have a matrix. The matrix is something I developed, and it's an analysis based on the functions of money. So the 2 columns, they represent the 2 main options for the unit of account. And they are fiat money for the left, and on the right-hand side, it's carbon units. This gentleman here, Arthur Pigou, he developed the theory for externalities that economists refer to. You may have heard of Pigouvian taxes and subsidies, that's what we're looking at. He formalised the idea of externalities, negative, positive externalities. So our rows represent positive externalities and then negative externalities. So the top row, positive pricing, bottom row, negative pricing. This fellow here, Ronald Coase, he's an economist who came up with this theory about private trading to internalise the externality, and that helps to explain cap and trade. So our policy, you could call it a mitigate and trade, but that's just another name. I prefer to call it a carbon reward. So we're utilising this guy's theory to help justify this approach to pay for the mitigation. And this is really important because if this is correct, and if it can be sort of proven, then we're changing the fundamentals of standard theory. And we have a new conceptual model for the market failure. Now, not shown on the diagram is more detail, and that is the tax is used to achieve efficient markets, that's the concept, cost versus benefit. This is to achieve safety. It's a risk management objective, call it a guardrail, safety, and that's formalised. At this point in time, our team is launching our campaign to raise some money because we want to create a proper project to demonstrate the policy. We're going to do some interviews with experts, we're going to do interviews with business people and with stakeholders to explore the feasibility of the policy. We're going to do economic assessments, and it's called stakeholder mapping. We don't intend to create a carbon currency at this stage because that's a little bit tricky, but we can talk about that later. If you go to our landing page, you can download the concept paper. It gives a good summary of what's going on. This is coming out soon. This will have the details, the concepts. It's about 40 to 50 pages with an appendix explaining the concepts of the theory. Okay, back to the policy. The carbon currency is the instrument, and so we need to understand its unit of account. It's simply a ton of CO2 mitigated for a 100-year duration. This is important because obviously global warming potential of gases and so on. Technically, it's a representative currency. It will be an international token tradable in the Forex, and thus it will have its own ISO code, which could be XCC. There are analogues, there's XAU for gold and so on. Important is that it's not a medium of exchange. It's not the purpose of the currency. It's there as a price signal and as an asset. Also, it's not a carbon credit. There's no offsetting in the policy. And that's incredibly important because by fully funding the policy in the carbon currency, we won't need offsetting, and then we can de-risk the climate problem. It doesn't mean that offsetting will be stopped. It'll continue. It's just that this is another market. Here, I'm just explaining technically what a carbon reward actually is. So the reward is not the currency. The reward is the exchange rate. So the reward is defined in terms of any exchange rate currency pair with XCC as the base. You just pick your quote currency. So if you're using Colombian pesos, use that. Look up the exchange rate and it will tell you the value of the reward in pesos. In this example, it's US dollars per tonne of CO2. This currency will be different to other currencies. Currencies today have a floating exchange rate. This one will have a guaranteed floor price. I'm going to explain how the market works, just in terms of supply-demand. We need an institution. In the novel, it's the Ministry for the Future. In this policy, it's called the Carbon Exchange Authority. So the authority has control over the policy, the standards and everything, and it will issue the digital currency to awardees, the businesses that are mitigating. They can then sell that currency for fiat in open markets. So that carbon currency will be traded in retail and wholesale markets to private traders. I'll explain why they'll buy it. Okay? At this point, the flow is that when there's not enough demand in the private market, the central banks, they're the guarantors. If there's not enough demand, they will buy the carbon currency and hold it on their balance sheet. As they do that, they're creating more fiat, and that goes into circulation, and thus we do get monetary inflation, but it's not as bad as that might sound at first. So that's the basic supply-demand model. Just to clarify, this is the balance sheet. So the issuer is the Carbon Exchange Authority, that's our Ministry for the Future. They issue the currency as their liability, but they have on their balance sheet service level agreements as an asset. These are long-term 100-year agreements that contain all the details for MRV and performance obligations and so on. We could talk about that. The awardees, those agreements are their liabilities and the currency is their asset. By analogy, think of a mortgage. You've got a mortgage contract and a commercial bank gives money in a similar way. On the demand side, I mentioned investors. They just buy it as an asset. Central banks, they're the guarantor. They will buy it. They will have to issue new money. In this case, it's the Federal Reserve, obviously, because they're issuing US dollars. The method of producing that money is called carbon quantitative easing. Similar to QE, but here the central banks are not buying financial assets. They're buying our currency, which transfers purchasing power to the productive sectors of the economy, which is good for jobs and the environment. So this is, I think, much more ethical than the QE that we've seen since the global financial crisis. We're going for time. Okay, I better speed up a little bit. This is a hypothetical price chart for the global carbon reward. These numbers are actually quite realistic. It's a hypothetical for the year 2045. The point here is that this black thick line, that's going to be calibrated to the minimum amount of carbon removal we need. Thus, this reward price is actually explicitly pricing carbon dioxide removal to achieve our carbon budget for 1.5 or 2 degrees or whatever it will be. You'll notice something that this will be guaranteed. It will be communicated over the long term with floor price guidance. This is important because then market actors can invest in large projects knowing that the project will be rewarded with carbon currency that's backed and guaranteed by central banks. So this becomes a bankable future revenue source, and that will open up the market to equity finance and debt finance. There's a shorter period here called the guaranteed floor, which is maybe 10, 20 years, and that's explicitly defined. Beyond that, the institution needs more flexibility because things change. Over time, we could have more climate feedbacks and all sorts of changes that are unexpected. The red there is the historical spot price, just to show that it can trade above the floor. This private trading is the example of Gaussian bargaining. And this price signal will internalise the cost of mitigation for a safer climate. The way the policy is structured is that it's based on three major rules. One for clean energy, a second for cleaner business, the third for carbon removal. This one's relatively easy to understand because I just explained it actually. It's an explicit price based on what's expected as the cost per tonne into the long term. Rules 1 and 2 are more complex, and this is because we have the problem of baselines. The baseline here is essentially zero, but as you know, counterfactual baselines are always problematic. In this policy, we take a somewhat different approach to carbon markets today because there's no carbon offsetting, so it's fully funded. Therefore, we're not so reliant on the counterfactual baseline. What we want to know is the additionality significant. Once we establish its significance, and generally speaking it will be significant because we won't reward projects that are non-significant, that's just logical. Once it's significant, for example, decarbonising the maritime sector, we then focus on the price. Okay? So our policy is going to provide prescribed baselines that are calibrated for price points to make sure there's enough finance for industries to sign a service level agreement. This approach is called cost effectiveness. The rule is slightly different for the demand side of energy versus the supply side. Energy, rule 1. I'm not going to go through rule 2 because I won't have time, but rule 1, very quickly, there are many ways to provide the reward. We can set carbon intensity baselines such as grams per kilometre travelled or tonnes per cash flow. So this is what we prescribe to do the computations for rewards, but we can also offer the reward through reverse auctions, which is setting a quota of carbon or carbon currency we want to issue in a year, and we ask the marketplace to apply, and then we can issue it. Or when there's a smaller number of very large actors like governments or major energy corporations, we could simply go into negotiations. The name of the game is to get them to sign on to performance obligations. That's the service level agreement for radical transition. Important is that the rule can be used to deleverage fossil assets. A good example is keeping fossil fuels in the ground, say for example in the Congo, in the peatland forests, or Ecuador, the Yasuni National Park, those types of situations. We can offer the carbon currency to license holders of these mining sites or oil drilling sites and say, well, we'll pay you carbon currency, but you have to take that money and invest it in renewable energy infrastructure, which becomes their asset, and they can earn long-term revenue through those assets. So basically this approach is called an energy asset exchange. And this is the way to keep the fossil fuels in the ground and also help developing countries skip the Industrial Revolution. The Rule 2 can be used with Rule 1 macroeconomically to balance energy supply demand. In summary, we have the three rules. The first platform, I've explained those rules. We also have three more rules for co-benefits. So we can create a secondary price signal to incentivise more reliable energy suppliers, community well-being, and ecosystem health. These platforms, for these co-benefits, this is where blockchains can really, or blockchain type technologies can be utilised, because these will be very decentralised. These rules need a platform too, and that will require administrative systems for pulling in third-party assessors, long-term data security. I think content addressing would be a very, very good system, given that we have long-term 100-year service level agreements. Smart administration, I could imagine our service level agreements being on smart contracts at some point, and MRV. A lot of detail there, which I'm not going to try and explain here, but MRV can be adapted depending on the risks involved in each project. So more rigorous for high-risk projects, less rigorous for low-risk technologies. There is centralisation as well. I know a lot of people don't like centralisation, but I see we need a balance. The carbon exchange standard, the XCC floor price, authority and mandates, that's somewhat centralised or very centralised. Here is the real opportunity, I think, for blockchains. Not so much in the monetary world, because that's taken care of by corporates and governments. But here, this could be huge, where we create a decentralised platform for these stakeholder groups that could organise or self-organise as DAOs. I think that would work well. We need to identify the co-benefits and harms. That's what this is for, actually. We invite the stakeholders to identify what's important in terms of harms and co-benefits. We achieve consensus on these for ranking, and then we use the ranking to score the projects. Once we've scored the projects, then we can adjust their rewards up or down. This is how we plan to create the secondary price signal, and the accounting is maintained via a simple rule. And the rule is simply this: if you reward more, then you have to reward less on another project. So all the adjustments add to zero. If you're interested in this, come and speak to me. I think I have 5 or so minutes left. Just to finish my presentation, 5 minutes, I thought I'd end with some philosophy around this topic of growth versus degrowth. Now, growth versus degrowth is probably one of the most important and topical issues in sustainability theory, academic theory, and environmental narratives. Because we've reached a point in human history where this growth narrative isn't really working. The green growth narrative is not really getting us there. We can see that with the trajectory of carbon emissions and so on. So what do we do about this? Some people propose that we degrow the economy, which simply means shrinking the pie. My point of view is that we don't really have explicit policies for that, and I think that will be problematic. My argument is that growth versus green growth is a false dichotomy. And I put forward an alternative that is linked to the carbon cycle. So you've seen this before, I'm sure. Let's go back to the carbon cycle and think about how nature deals with growth versus degrowth, even if it does at all. So photosynthesis is pulling carbon in, respiring organisms, animals, exhale CO2, we have the human input, factories, combustion, and you know the rest, carbon goes into the soil, and over a long term, that's the slow carbon cycle. If we were to look closely at ecosystems and organisms, what I found, and I think it's definitely true, respiring organisms and cells have natural carbon lock-in. They cannot reverse their chemistry for reasons to do with their genetic specialization. So cells, animals like ourselves, we respire, we can't reverse that chemistry, we can't absorb CO2, we can't photosynthesize, so we are locked in. It's a natural phenomenon. And the point I want to make is that the way nature achieves net zero, and it does, ecosystems, plants can achieve net zero in controlled environments or in the natural world. It does that through 2 metabolic pathways, photosynthesis, respiration, and it can balance out under certain conditions. It's really a supply-limited system. Depending on what's available from the environment, from sunlight and so on, a certain amount of sugars will limit respiration. So it's a self-limiting system with carbon lock-in on that end. They call this symbiosis, or food web. What I claim is that our economy, our civilization, has a similar problem, that we have carbon lock-in too. However, our lock-in is biosocial. It's a product of social networks. So the most important social network actually that causes lock-in, in my opinion, is the monetary system. So the monetary system forces market actors to make a profit because they have to pay back their loans with interest, and it sets us on a growth trajectory. Most of our money is actually debt-based. So, in my opinion, the source of the climate risk is actually emanating from this carbon lock-in, which is societal. It includes the monetary system, the political system, legal system, education, every kind of social system that you can think of, which is cultural. So the resolution from a systems perspective is to introduce a parallel economy. How do we do that? With a parallel currency. So our carbon currency literally creates a parallel economy. The flow of energy and resources comes from the first system to the second via the exchange rate, which I showed in the earlier graph. And this is how we circumvent the carbon lock-in effect to achieve a rapid, exponential-like social economic response, or shift away from dangerous global warming. So in the diagram I've pointed out, this system is defined by its fiat currencies, this by the carbon currency, and this model is actually completely different to the model that academics and scholars are using, because they're thinking about single systems for degrowth. This is not degrowth. This is more like symbiosis, and this is how the new model explains the negative externalities, the positive externalities, and how to achieve carbon neutrality. So, just to finish, answering the question once more, do we need to degrow the economy to achieve net zero carbon? Should we put our trust in green growth? I think my answer is, this is my advice, you don't have to agree with me, it's a hypothesis, but my argument is we need optimal growth, and I define optimal growth as two economies coexisting. They're both specialised. The new economy is specialised for greenhouse gas mitigation, and the relationship is symbiotic based on carbon currency exchange rates. And so thank you very much.